Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sexy Business Podcast. My name is Lewd Neko, and joining me, as always, is Spooky Dangerous.
Hello.
And today we are going to be talking about Phenoxo's very well known text based erotic RPGs, Corruptions of Champions 1 and 2, and Trials in Tainted Space.
Yeah, so this is going to be slightly interesting and maybe a little bit more of a challenge for us because I've only played Trials in Tainted Space and Neko has only played the Corruptions of Champions series. But I think there's something interesting to be said about a text dominated game like this being successful because a lot of the complaints about more visual novel style games is that it doesn't have enough art. Um, Even though visual novel is meant to be predominantly text. So for something to be both marketed and delivering as predominantly text to be successful has my curiosity. Did you want to give us a bit of an overview of how these games kind of play?
Sure. So, Corruptions of Champions and Trials in Tainted Space, which I think, for the sake of breath, I'm going to be referring to as Cock and Tits, respectively, from here on out, are very similar games. They're just taking different genres. Cock is going to be more of a fantasy D&D world, whereas Tits is sci-fi and space and things like that. In both of these, you're going to have a player character that you can customize pretty thoroughly. So you can choose gender, genitalia, what they look like, their class, other skills and traits. And then as you go through the story, one of the biggest appeals is one, the sheer amount of characters that you can fuck, especially since they're oftentimes going to be some flavor of monster or demi-human or something like that. And then also, transformation is a really big appeal for a lot of people. There's so many items in this game, or certain fights where if you lose them, where you might end up transformed into a different animal. Your tits might get bigger. You might grow a cock or a pussy or all sorts of different things. So, for a lot of people, this either gave them a transformation fetish or it allowed them to fulfill their biggest fantasies. And I think the last kink this one plays into a lot is breeding. There is a lot of options for pregnancy, for egg laying, both your player character or you onto other NPCs.
Yeah, I think firstly the greatest advantage that it has is the customization of it. Because when you, and let's use Tales of Androgyny for an example, right? When something happens to the main character, it has to be reflected in the image gallery when it's actually playing out a scene. Otherwise, that thing has effectively never happened. In a purely text based action scene, you can just have a placeholder that has like this sentence is reserved for all of the different possible options of your this factor. Like it could be cup size, it could be pregnancy, yes, no, it could be, are you a particular animal or whatever, right? And it just plays through and runs all the different specific different options for what your person has particularly become, which plays pretty smoothly. The thing that I thought was really interesting was when you do character creation in tits, it's the perspective is a little different, right? It's your ancestor genetically creating you to come and fulfill out whatever the mission is, right? And so when you're designing the character, you're talking to a doctor, I think. And this all could be relatively wrong. This is like years ago of memory of when I did play this game. But when you put in what options you want, the doctor remarks on each different thing. And so if you like when the doctor asks about how big a dick the character should have, the your ancestor remarks is like, why is this relevant? And or it's like, yeah, I want my character to be super successful, or it's like my character's a girl. Why do they need this? And the doctor's like, I'm not here to judge. Look, whatever they need to get the job done, kind of a thing. Which I always thought was kind of funny. Like they found interesting ways to remark upon what combination of things you could have, and how you've set up your character and how sexy or whatever you're supposed to be. And then in the way that you interact with other characters and stuff, it plays out in the same way, where it's like, oh, you have this thing, I'm interested about this thing, or this thing about you has changed, and then now people will remark upon that change, or what that thing has changed into. One of the other things that I guess we hadn't really touched on yet was how kind of like combat or like moving around and interacting and stuff works, because with a visual novel, most of the time you would just kind of click it and the dialogue progresses, and then you have like dialogue options, and that is how you navigate throughout the world. With this, it has like a nodes system where you travel along different lines which represent locations or like places to get there, and then when you do enter a combat, you have a bunch of different options as to like how you're trying to interact with them or whatever. Think of it like how Pokemon's UI works, where it's like you've got fight, you've got bag, you've got run, kind of a thing. So it is relatively simple in its design, but I think the thing that makes it special is the vastness of text that has been put in the game.
Oh yeah. If you are someone who doesn't like reading, this is definitely not the game for you. There are very, very long sex scenes as well as just sort of story scenes, which is the big appeal for me as somebody who really loves erotica. I was always really impressed by the sheer amount of sort of lore and world building they chose to include in this game. I recently played through a pretty good chunk of Corruptions of Champions 2 on my own time, and there are just so many side stories and characters and also options. So if you are someone who enjoys different routes, as the name of Corruptions of Champions would imply, you can choose. Do you want to be the good character who does things consensually and always does the right thing, or do you want to allow the corruption to happen, to take advantage of characters, to even corrupt other characters? And that will have sort of long-term effects on how you interact with various party members, as well as the different kinds of endings and storylines you can get.
Yeah, which I think is kind of interesting. Because normally when something is designed for how you're supposed to interact with the character, right? Think of something like Baldur's Gate 3, which we assume to be incredibly accessible with the options and stuff that you have, is still limited to what dialogue has been voiced, right? And what, kind of animations or whatever they've designed for the game. When stuff is written, and only written, you're not relying on any other department to limit how much of a thing can be done, right? So you're able to make many more routes available. You're able to write whole side sections without needing specific art for it, right? Like one of the big limitations on uh, Shackles of Elswyn, for example, is art. So it's like we're not going to go and do a scene if we don't have art for it. Because that game it's specifically designed to not have character expressions where they're just sitting there talking to each other. So it'll mean that you're just staring at the same static image for the entire time that this side adventure is happening, and it's not going to be very interesting. Whereas with this, that's the whole game. That's what you sign up for. It's what you're expecting, and it is kind of delivering on something. And I think that looser thing is probably not the way to describe it, but that more freedom to focus on written story rather than having to connect so many different aspects together, right? Gives a really cool and interesting freedom where you can be like, you know what, fuck it, I feel like writing about big milky titties today, and then tomorrow I'm going to investigate ovipositors and bees and all these other things, and you can just kind of hit so many different niches and categories because you don't have to overinvest in other sections. Like it doesn't take screen time away from something. You can just go, well, and if they don't like it, they won't navigate to it, and that's still also fine. Which I think is really interesting, especially because they're both pretty big games that you're able to just go, well, this month I've just spent time writing on this whole thing that people might never actually read and get to, but the people that are super interested in this one particular niche are going to go feral. And I think that definitely is a way to cultivate a rabid fan base.
Yeah, I will say from an update perspective, Corruption of Champions 2 is incredibly consistent as far as updates go. They have a huge Patreon that's getting like 28,000 a month. They have a subscribe star that's also receiving money, and then you can also just buy the game once on Steam, and I think you get I don't think it's the newest update. I think it's like the second newest update or something like that. I could be wrong about that, but I see the little updates like almost pretty much every month. And usually it's centered around a particular character or a kink. Like I know they did like maternity, back in the summer, and so they
Yeah.
added some more pregnancy scenes and things like that. And I think the nice thing about Corruptions of Champions is obviously these are very kinky games. There are all sorts of kink. There's transformation. There's non-consent. There's romantic, cute sex. There's monster girls of all shapes and sizes, the pregnancy and things like that. And while you can't avoid everything, of course, you can steer clear of things you don't like, or you can, sort of finagle the gameplay where, like, if you don't ever want to deal with a non-consent scene, you better get good. um, and even when you defeat other characters, usually it'll give you an option of like, do you actually want to fuck this character, or do you want to just leave and sort of take the money and go? So if you aren't particularly attracted to whatever character you're fighting, you're not forced to do anything to them upon defeat. Or if like you're role playing, I think Corruptions of Champions can be a fun game to role play with. You could try to be like the good guy character, or you're gonna like do everything by the book and be nice to others, and then maybe have a different save where you're going to be an absolute bastard and play around with that and see like how it makes you feel, or maybe what different dialogue responses you get. Because as Spooky mentioned, characters will comment on what kind of race you are. For example, like I did a playthrough where I was like their lupine race, and every time I met a lupine character, they sort of greet you with more familiarity, or there's like a couple of differences in dialogue. But there also be differences depending on like where you are in a certain storyline, or like if you saved a character or not, or if you like succeeded or failed at this thing. Like characters will sort of remember that, and I think that's what makes this game, especially Corruption Champions 2, like so immersive and fun to play. Possibly repeated times, is that you get to see those differences depending on how you're playing, and it makes it feel like, oh, playing this game again was worth it.
Yeah, I did feel a little bit of that as well because obviously with into the character creator you had a lot of different options. So I came back and tried a bunch of different things, but I also found that I was just very quickly transformed into something weird and different. And every single time I was just like, yeah, fuck it, let's do it. I'll find out what happens. Um,
Yeah.
Bees being the first and most obvious one. So I think it's just an early planet that you have access to. But in the same way, where it's like, oh, if I'm hating this, you can just fly to a whole different planet with a whole different series of people. Like, you don't have to chronologically chew through something to get to the end or to the beginning. You can just kind of bump out, go try out this new thing. Here's a whole bunch of new people. And upon introduction to something, you usually are able to get a pretty good feel for what the vibe is, or what the kink or the niche is going to be. Like early on, it's pretty easy to find a planet that has cow people, and there's a specific thing that you can do to make you more cow like, and it's like, yes, I foresee milk in my future upon arriving.
I will also say something sort of nice about the text-based RPG as opposed to the visual novel. So I'm a stickler for like reading as much as I possibly can of a story, because I'm always convinced if I skip through a sex scene, I'm going to miss something really important. It's going to come back later. I'm going to be like, damn, I didn't read that one scene close enough. And if you're trying to skim through a visual novel, it's hard to do because text comes, a couple of sentences at a time. One of the things I liked about Crypto Champions 2 is, so you receive text in like huge bricks, basically. So an entire sex scene is probably going to be on one page that you scroll through, or maybe two if it's really long. So I can pretty quickly like skim through it just to make sure like I'm not missing anything, especially if it's like the main antagonist, for example, where you do actually have sort of an interesting dynamic and relationship with her. But at the same time, if I'm not horny or I'm like not feeling this character, I can sort of just like quickly look at the art, get the feel for the scene or any consequences that might have happened, and then just move on to the next part. So just because you're faced with a wall of text in the game doesn't mean you have to read it. Because I think my one complaint is I will say there are times where I'm like, wow, this is way too damn wordy, where it just gets to the point where it's like superfluous just how much it's describing this particular room, and I'm kind of just like, can you give me the summary or like the important parts? Like, do I need to know what material the stones are made out of and that there's two mushrooms in one corner and a rock in the other?
The Corruption of Champions Spark Notes page be going wild right now.
Please. I guess that's the only downside is while there is a CG gallery, Corruptions of Champions 2 at least has a handful of CGs you can unlock from specific scenes. I do sort of wish there was like a erotica gallery where like you can revisit like text that you've gotten in the past. Because I actually so Corruptions of Champions 1 was one of the first adult games I ever really got into when I was a teenager. I've talked about this maybe in the past, but there is a particular character in it named Kelt who is a horribly misogynistic centaur who non-cons you. This was fascinating to teenage Neko, so I did all of his scenes and copy and pasted them into a Google Doc that I still have,
Oh,
just so I can reread them like over and over again. I still have that Google Doc and they're still good.
That's so funny. First of all, I'm very proud of you for sharing. That was very cringe. Uh, but that speaks to how good and how powerful the medium can be versus what. Like, we have an interesting spectrum of things where it comes from NSFW gaming, right? Where far on one end, I would say, would be VR game where all of the characters are fully customizable and interactable and all this kind of stuff. Where it's like fucking 4K HD and is a AAA studio game. Like in theory, that's the greatest possible thing that could be made with the tools we have today. And then on the far other end of the spectrum is something like this, where it is kind of just a choose your own adventure written story. Trials in Tainted Space, I don't remember ever really having many pictures at all. So there probably not a CG gallery. I don't know if that's changed since I played, but it being able to deliver all of the gameplay, which is text, is in theory just a really complicated manuscript from 1666. And it's interesting that something like that can still deliver, still be punchy, still be able to compete against what all this technology has given us the ability to develop. And what that tells us is the thing that is the most powerful is the story told. If we can deliver the interesting story told, if we can, cover the particular niche, the particular interest in such a way that it feels immersive, it feels exciting, and you there's stakes, and you care about the character and how everything comes together, is always going to hit harder than something that just looks good and has no substance.
Absolutely. And I think Finoxa is also really good at responding to like critiques and fixing things. Because I think you're right. Granted, it's been a long time since I've played the original Cock or Tits, which is very similar in style. They have very, very little art. I think they have some like character art, maybe, but I don't think they have any CGs. So that was something that was added, I believe, for Corruptions Champions 2. Another interesting thing is for a lot of the characters, there's actually multiple choices of artist for a character art. So, for example, Kate is a cat girl party character, and when you click on her, you get 3 options of what you want her character art to be every time she shows up. So if you really hate like one of the artists, you can try out one of the different ones. Now this isn't true for all characters, but for a vast majority of them, there's usually at least 2 different artist options for that. And then there's the CGs you can get. And they have also sort of fixed up the gameplay a little bit, in my opinion. I remember having some issues with Corruptions of Champions 1's gameplay being like a little unintuitive and a bit like overwhelming at times, as some text-based RPGs can be. And I think they just sort of tightened it up a lot for Corruptions of Champions 2, so it's a lot easier to follow the flow of combat. You also have multiple party members, so you have more options as far as like classes and balance and things like that, and a lot more that you can do in general. So if you are somebody who's sort of interested in the combat elements, there's stuff for you to do. And I will say, for those of you who are like, wow, I actually don't care about the RPG combat elements at all, I just want to get fucked. Corruption Champions 2 does have a difficulty mode that's basically just reading. So
That's pretty good. One of the things that I felt was really similar to the combat system was how Tales of Androgyny does it. Obviously, TOA is much more complicated because it has many, many more options with what you can be doing.
mhm.
But that same, I fight and win with strength, or I fight and win with lust, or I fail and let you fuck me. It feels like the same kind of system, and you kind of know what your outcomes are, and you don't just lose the game most of the time. Like, you're not just like, oh no, if I
Yeah.
die, I have to reset and read all of that again. No, it's not actually that big of a deal. It's just like a conflict rather than a threat on your life, which I think is interesting and allows you to go, oh, what if the bee person stings me several times? What happens then? Oh, I'm just getting hornier every single time. Do I actually like being stung by a bee? And then your character starts transforming and you become a queen bee or something like that. And you're like, oh, was this maybe what I wanted all along? Probably not, but I'm here now.
Yeah, I will say something that's a little bit nicer compared to Tales of Androgyny is that the sort of lust mechanic is a lot more plain and clear, especially in
Yeah.
Corruptions of Champions 2. It's like both physical attacks and sort of like lust attacks just affect the HP bar, so you don't have to track like two different stats. And it's just like you can choose, do you want to defeat them sexually or do you want to defeat them with a sword? And either way, no matter how you defeat them, you can still fuck them at the end. You
With
know?
style or
Um,
steel, whoever wins tops. Yeah, for real.
Basically. And then I think the other interesting thing is there's a lot of bad ends that you can pursue. Like there's so many. And the game auto saves really frequently. So it think in its settings it auto saves every 5 minutes and you can adjust that, which is important because there are a lot of, changes that can happen in Corruptions of Champions 2 where that either you're gonna really like it or you're gonna really not like it. So, for example, the transformations, you might have a kink or something that you didn't want to happen to your player character. So, for example, if you're like, I do not want this character to have big tits, or I don't want her to have a pussy or him or them or whatever, and that happens to you, you can always like go back to a save pretty easily. Or if you like get a really bad ending or you fuck up around and, go somewhere with the enemies are just like too difficult or whatever, it's a lot more easy to recover a save. Whereas I found Tales of Androgyny, it was pretty easy to fuck yourself over kind of bad.
Yeah. You do go directly from combat to a game over screen pretty quickly. And even though the game does have an autosave function, it still is like, what? Oh, okay. Which kind of hurts. Feeling like you've lost time in any video game
Yeah.
can be a real bounce factor that can make you bounce off a game and move away from something else. Because that happens to me all the time. A lot of the time, I'll be playing something and I either get lost in a loop where I feel like I'm unable to progress. This happened to me in The Witcher, where it's like I cannot figure out where I'm supposed to go next because there's no quest marker. It's happened to me in
Mm.
Baldur's Gate 3, where it's like, you have to go here, and I'm like, okay, the way on the map that looks like I'm supposed to go that way does not take me there, and I cannot find the route. I'm now stuck. Or something like that, where it's like, well, this thing happened, or I game over and I have to backtrack this far. I'm suddenly less interested, and feeling like you've lost time can be a big way to lose the space. But
Yeah.
sometimes just plodding on ahead, like, whatever, my character's got this thing now. In Tits, you were able to change yourself back without too much difficulty. Like, you encounter a rogue surgeon pretty early on. It's like, well, I can fix this, I can change this, or I can improve this, or whatever for you. So it never felt like you were so stuck.
Yeah, there's usually ways you can change back. And then there is also, I can't remember if this was in Cock or Tits, but I know in Cock too, there is a quest system. So it is a lot easier to keep track of like what was I doing. It has like main quests and there's a lot of side quests in Cock too, especially, which helps quite a bit to have sort of clear directions of like, you need to get these 4 items or you need to go to this place. And it's usually not too difficult to figure out like where something's telling you to go. And especially in the early game, there's like a couple different areas you can explore when you're still on those like beginner levels. So you have a lot of options as far as like, oh, do you want to go straight for the main story or do you want to take a detour and visit the farm with all the cute cowgirls or do this like random side quest or whatever. There's like party characters you can unlock and shit like that. So even if you take like a really long break from Corruptions of Champions 2 and come back to it, it's usually pretty easy to like pick up and figure out where you are. The only inconvenient thing compared to like a visual novel, for example, is that you can't tell what text you've read before. Um, that was something I like about playing visual novels is if I'm playing through multiple routes, I can quickly skip through the stuff I've already seen, especially when there's minor changes in dialogue. So when there's like one new piece of dialogue because I made like one decision early on, I like being able to see that in a visual novel, whereas that's not going to happen in a text-based RPG. So either you have to do a little bit of rereading or you just have to skip through some stuff and hope you don't miss anything.
Yeah, which can be a bit tough, but like the classic Vampire engine gives you the ability to skip directly to unread text and stuff like that, so that you can guarantee that you, on a replay, skip everything you've seen, see everything you haven't skipped, which is pretty good. And yeah, you will sometimes, but when it's a big brick and you look at it and you go, "This looks familiar," it's a bit easier to skip than having to see 16 continuous sentences that you have to mouse through one by one to double check.
Oh God, yeah.
So it might not be as bad as it sounds, but I do think that there is perhaps space for more than two of these things, two of these types of game to exist. I am probably not the person to make it. I'm too visual. I'm too much of an art director to be able to make it. But I think that I would enjoy playing other games that have that kind of insane freedom and so many different niches and interests and stuff like that. Especially as a young person playing it, it was like, wow, that's cool. I get to do this thing, or I get to become like this, or I can change this thing, or and that same feeling of excitement that TOA gave, where it's like, oh wow, you're tracking the diameter of my butthole. That's cool, and you can see exactly how the world has impacted your character. Which in a lot of traditional storytelling, like big cinema and movies and stuff, your main character either changes not at all, or the story ends and they go, yeah, actually they're back to exactly where they started. Congrats, nothing changed. Or it's just not visible in a way, like the scars that teach us invisible trauma, which in itself is really hard to show and stuff as well. So with stuff like this where you're able to actually see your character change and grow, and it reports that to you, and you physically change along with the story, is very interesting to me. So I am excited to potentially hear if there is more like this in the space. So if you have a favorite text-based game, let us know in the comments. Maybe we'll play it for an episode. I'd love to hear what kind of things I haven't seen. There's plenty of games out there that exist that I've probably never heard of, and I would love to know. But that is another episode of the Sexy Business Podcast. This week, we're very excited to talk about something a little different, especially Neko. I think this is one of your favorite games for sure.
It's like one of my favorites.
But that means that you need to now click the like button, click the subscribe button. This is non-negotiable. You've watched 30 minutes into the episode. You've by doing so agreed to provide us with the happy analytic numbers. And additionally, you've signed yourself up for an adventure next week when you see the next episode of the Sexy Business Podcast.
Bye-bye.